Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Pied Piper of Pasadena Part 3. This is the story of Dean Corll. Now when we last left off, we had talked about Dean Corll's upbringing in his childhood with Mother Mary and his father Arnold, and leading up to his adolescence years to where Mary would divorce Arnold and get married to Jake West. Which at that point, after Mary would marry Jake West, they would move to Vidor, which is basically a very small moonshining town. Now when it came time for Dean to learn about the birds and the bees, Mary would, one summer, take Dean and send him over to her family's farm where her parents resided at Fort Wayne, Indiana. Mary would later go and say that she didn't really want to talk to the boys about the birds and the bees, and figured if the boys were going to learn how people acted during that certain act, the best way for boys to learn was to go on the farm and watch the farm animals, quote unquote, go at it, end quote. And the only thing that can be said about Vidor, other than the few bad things that I have read about it, was that there was a very large abundance of pecans that would be in Vidor. And on one particular day, Mary and Jake would actually take Stanley and Dean and drive around to these areas where there was an abundance of pecans. And they would take these buckets and fill them up to the brim. And they would put these buckets in the back of their car. And after they had gotten a large quantity of pecans, they would also take everyone in the car and drive over to a local candy store that resided in Houston, Texas. They would walk into this local chocolate factory and purchase a formula for pralines. Now, if you're not really familiar what a praline is, it is a kind of a chewy chocolate dessert made out of pecans, chocolate, caramel, and cream. And they would purchase this formula for about $50. And back then, $50 would be equivalent to what is today around $578. And after they acquired the formula, they would drive back to Vidor to their home, and they would begin manufacturing these pralines in the garage of their house. Once they would get to the home and manufacture the pralines, Dean would actually be in charge of wrapping up the pralines and putting them into these boxes. He would take a small quantity of the pralines and walk around the town of Vidor and sell them door to door, and would pocket the money that he made from selling the pralines. Jake would get the bulk of the pralines they would make, and when he would go on his business trips, he would sell these candies on the side as a way to start up a new side business. The business would be very successful. They would eventually name their candy Pecan Prince, and eventually they would begin purchasing machines to manufacture these candies in bulk. And it got to the point that they didn't have to hand pick these pecans in buckets and bring them to the house, and they were getting to the point to where the ingredients they would just buy in bulk. In 1958, the family would relocate from Vidor, Texas to Houston, Texas. And there they would open up a shop and open up a company to manufacture their candy in bulk. And they would name this company after their popular candy they had been selling, Pecan Prince. And both Stanley and Dean would work in this company with the family firm. But at this time, with Pecan Prince, Dean was not being compensated for his labor, and Jake's idea of how business should be ran and how Dean's idea of how the business should be ran were basically night and day, and they were constantly bad hits. And due to the fact that Dean was not being compensated or paid for his work, they would often argue a lot. And just to keep in mind, they were still in school when this is going on. So they didn't neglect their studies, but they would have to wake up, work at the factory, go to school, do their homework, work again at the factory, and go to bed, back and forth, pretty much 5 to 7 days a week. Now, in 1959, they would relocate again to Houston Heights, but around this time, Mary's father would actually fall ill and pass away. And while Mary's mother was actually grieving over the loss of her husband, Mary had decided that she would actually send Dean over to Indiana to take care of her grieving mother. And this was also for a fact that because Dean and Jake did not get along at all, this was just a best way to make sure that there was no more problems within the family. At 19, Dean would return to the farm and take care of his grieving grandmother. And shortly after arriving there, would begin working at a coil factory. It is said shortly after this, he would actually pick up a passion for not only photography, but would actually also purchase a video recorder. And he would have an infatuation with taking pictures and taking videos, and this would play a major role later on down the road. And it is also said during this time, he could actually be seen taking his video recorder and actually taping children over neighboring farms. But Dean and his grandmother would not get along and would constantly bat heads just as much as he would bat heads with Jake. And Dean's grandmother would go and say that Dean was extremely lazy and would slack off with a lot of chores. So Dean would begin ignoring his grandmother on a regular basis and began befriending a local girl in Indiana named Wanda. Wanda would show a great interest in Dean, but he would always reject her advances to being more than just friends. And around 1962, Mary would rewrite to Dean and ask him to return back to Houston Heights to help out with the company. And a way to convince him to move back is she would go and tell Dean that when he returned back, that they would actually give him a salary and he could actually make money and make a living working with the family company. So he would actually leave Indiana and move back to Houston Heights. Now, what he would do when he returned back to Houston Heights is the building that they had at that time was a 2-story factory building. And Dean would actually turn the second story into kind of like this makeshift apartment. And a little creepy side note to add about the company factory is it actually sat right across from an elementary school. Meanwhile, in Indiana, one particular morning, Wanda would actually call up Dean and ask him, "Are you sitting down?" Dean would reply, "No," to where Wanda would tell him to sit down. After which, Wanda would tell Dean that she was getting married. And Dean would reply, "To who?" And Wanda would reply, "To you." And looking at this, it is kind of a cute way for a girl to propose to a guy, but Dean didn't see it that way. He would quickly hang up the phone and quit talking to Wanda altogether. Around this time, when Dean began working at the company, he quickly earned the nickname the Candyman, because he would be known as someone that would not only walk around town, but even would go to various different schools and start handing out candy to children. In today's age, this would not be accepted any type of way or form, mainly because we would see that person as a predator. It would give off way too many red flags, especially giving off stranger danger. But back in the early 60s, people didn't see it that way, and they more or less viewed Dean Corll as someone that was a really loving person that worked at the candy shop that just loved kids. Almost like a Willy Wonka figure, if you will. But the only person that did suspect something was completely off was Jake West, and he would often get into arguments with Mary. Jake would approach and tell Mary that he definitely thought there was something off about Dean, that he was being extremely creepy, and he was actually very disturbed by his infatuation with children, especially little boys. But Mary would play it off that he was just a very loving person. And it would seem that not only was Mary completely homophobic, but was completely oblivious to the growing red flags that her son was presenting.